In December 2015, Scott Weiland was found dead on a tour bus. He was 48. No fight, no scandal, no goodbye note. By then, he had survived multiple overdoses, prison time, rehab after rehab, and more than 6 public comebacks. His music sold over 40 million records. The world kept pulling him back. So why did the savings stop working? In the early 1990s, Scott Weiland didn't just rise with alternative rock. He commandeered it. Between 1992 and 1996, his band released albums that went multi-platinum, packed arenas, and dominated rock radio. Night after night, tens of thousands watched a frontman who seemed untouchable, controlled, seductive, dangerous. From the outside, it looked like momentum. From the inside, it was maintenance. Tour schedules stacked cities back-to-back. Expectations stacked higher. The stage demanded the same intensity every night, no matter the cost. And the cost was paid off stage, quietly, chemically. By 1995, while the record sold and the lights stayed bright, the arrest began. Missed shows, court dates, rehab stays timed between tours like pit stops. The headlines kept calling it a phase. The fans kept calling it genius. Every comeback came with applause. Every relapse came with silence. And still, the machine kept moving. Because as long as the show sold out, the collapse could wait. This was the peak, the moment everyone remembers as triumph. But peaks have a blind spot, and no one was looking down. Before Scott Weiland became a symbol of 1990s rock, before his name fused with stages, lights, and a dangerous kind of magnetism, there was a child growing up in a prolonged state of emotional insecurity, not poverty in the material sense, but the absence of stability. Scott was born in 1967 in California, into a family that fractured early. His parents divorced when he was very young. The years that followed were marked by constant changes, homes, adults, environments, and a lingering feeling that there was no real place to belong. Psychologically, this kind of rupture rarely announces itself. It doesn't explode. It settles quietly, planting a question that repeats without resolution. Am I actually safe? For Scott, that question never found a clear answer. He learned to observe rather than trust, to manage expressions, to survive inside silence. Then came the defining rupture, the detail that only years later he would acknowledge publicly. Scott Weiland was sexually abused as a child, not a fleeting incident, but something deep enough to alter how he experienced the world and his own body. It didn't turn him immediately rebellious. It did something more dangerous. It taught him to detach from his emotions. Shame, violation, and helplessness weren't named or processed. They were pushed down, buried far below awareness. Music entered his life not as a career dream, but as shelter. When Scott listened, when he sang, there was a rare moment when he didn't have to be present inside himself. No remembering, no feeling, just existence inside sound. For many, that's passion. For Scott, it was a first escape that actually worked. His teenage years weren't extraordinary. He wasn't a prodigy. He wasn't a notorious troublemaker. He was a young person carrying layers of unspoken weight, slowly developing a habit of avoiding his inner life. This is a critical foundation. When someone never learns how to sit with pain early on, they will spend adulthood searching for ways not to feel it. What's striking is that Scott didn't immediately turn to substances. He turned to performance. Even before large stages, he instinctively understood that becoming someone else could quiet the noise. This was the seed of the persona that would later define him. Seductive, volatile, commanding the gaze of others, not for shock value, but to avoid being seen too closely. That in hindsight, Scott Weiland's childhood doesn't explain everything that followed, but it explains one essential truth. He didn't grow up with tools for self-soothing. He lacked language for trauma. He never learned how to remain present with pain without collapsing. So when fame arrived too quickly, when pressure accumulated too early, what had never been healed didn't disappear. It waited, and the question left hanging from those early years still matters. When a person learns to survive by escaping themselves from the very beginning, is there ever a path back to rest? Scott Weiland didn't enter music with a plan. There was no long-term vision, no carefully mapped career. What he entered was a process of becoming someone else. One room, one rehearsal, one small stage at a time. In the late 1980s, Los Angeles was saturated with ambition. Bands formed and dissolved weekly. Talent was common. Stability was not. Scott moved through this environment quietly at first, absorbing more than he projected, learning how rooms reacted to presence rather than sound. When he met the DeLeo brothers, the connection wasn't ideological. It was practical. They shared an instinct for melody and tension. Scott brought something harder to define, a voice that felt inhabited, as if it carried more history than his age suggested. The band that would become Stone Temple Pilots didn't arrive as a cultural statement. It arrived as momentum. Rehearsals tightened. Songs accumulated. Shows followed. And with each performance, Scott discovered something important. When he stepped into the role of a frontman, his internal noise went quiet. On stage, he wasn't processing. He was directing. His body became an instrument. His movements were deliberate, almost calculated. The audience didn't just listen, they watched. That gaze mattered, not because it fed his ego, but because it anchored him. For the length of the set, he was no longer drifting. He was fixed, defined, necessary. But this clarity only existed under lights. Off stage, the contrast was immediate. The silence returned faster. The weight resurfaced. And the tools to manage that weight were still missing. This is where substances began to appear. Not dramatically, not recklessly at first. They entered as solutions, not indulgences. Something to slow the thoughts. Something to soften the edges. Something that made the transition from stage to reality less abrupt. As Stone Temple Pilots gained traction, the pace accelerated. Small clubs became larger venues. Regional attention turned national. The industry moved quickly when it sensed potential. Contract arrived before emotional readiness. Schedules filled before habits stabilized. Scott learned how to perform confidence long before he learned how to live with it. There was an unspoken agreement forming around him. As long as he delivered on stage, the rest was secondary. Missed sleep was ignored. Mood shifts were tolerated. Early warning signs were reframed as rock behavior. This wasn't neglect. It was normalization. And normalization is dangerous when someone is quietly unraveling. Scott's persona began to sharpen during this period. He wasn't copying anyone directly, but he understood lineage. He studied how presence could be controlled, how sexuality and menace could coexist, how unpredictability could feel intentional. This wasn't rebellion. It was construction, a version of himself strong enough to survive attention. The irony is that the more convincing this persona became, the less space there was for the person underneath it. Friends began to interact with the role. Industry figures reinforced the image. Audiences rewarded the performance. And Scott, who had learned early in life to survive by detaching, slipped further into that separation. By the time Stone Temple Pilots broke into the mainstream, the foundation was already unstable. Success hadn't caused a fracture. It had simply pressurized it. The mechanisms Scott used to cope were no longer occasional. They were becoming structural, necessary to function, necessary to maintain the pace. This phase is often remembered as the beginning of something great, and it was. But it was also the moment where a private coping strategy became entangled with public expectation, where the line between survival and self-destruction began to blur. Because once a person learns that pain disappears when the music starts, the silence afterward becomes something to fear, and the question that follows is unavoidable. When your first real sense of control comes from performing someone else, how long can you exist without the stage before you lose yourself entirely? By the early 1990s, Scott Weiland was no longer moving toward success. He was already inside it. Stone Temple Pilots broke into the mainstream at a speed that left no room for adjustment. Albums went multi-platinum. Singles saturated rock radio. Tours expanded from months to years. And Scott, now positioned at the center of it all, became the image people associated with the sound of a generation. On stage, he was precise, not chaotic, not sloppy, precise. Every movement looked intentional. Every pause felt loaded. He didn't just sing songs. He controlled the room. Thousands of eyes followed him instinctively, as if he were setting the tempo for the crowd's breath. This was an accident or raw impulse. It was awareness. He knew where to stand. when to turn, when to pull back. The performance wasn't excess. It was discipline disguised as danger. From the outside, this looked like confidence. From the inside, it was containment. The demands escalated quickly. New albums meant new tours. New tours meant longer nights, shorter breaks, and constant travel. Cities blurred together. Sleep became irregular. Privacy disappeared. Interviews repeated the same questions. Photo shoots froze him into a single expression. The industry rewarded consistency. Fans wanted the same intensity every night. The version of Scott Weiland they loved wasn't allowed to fluctuate, and so it didn't. To meet that expectation, the cost moved off stage. Substances were no longer occasional tools. They became part of the routine. Something to activate before the show, something to descend afterward. The body learned the cycle. The mind adjusted around it. And because the performance never visibly suffered, no one interrupted the process. This is where the halo formed. The protective myth around him, the idea that he was simply wired differently, that his volatility was artistic fuel, that his lifestyle was proof of authenticity. The more the image solidified, the harder it became to question it. Concern sounded like misunderstanding. Intervention sounded like sabotage. Meanwhile, the arrest began to appear quietly in the background, minor at first, easily explained away. The narrative didn't change. Albums still sold, venues still filled, applause still came on cue. Each success worked like a cover, allowing the damage to continue without consequence. What made this period especially dangerous was its lack of obvious collapse. There was no single breaking point, no dramatic implosion, just accumulation. Exhaustion layered over expectation. Dependency layered over performance. The public saw momentum. Scott experienced maintenance. Interpersonally, the distance widened. Relationships strained under the weight of unpredictability. Family life bent around touring schedules and emotional absence. But even here, the success buffered everything. Problems could be postponed. Apologies could be delayed. The machine kept moving. This was the height of the halo. The moment when talent, myth, and tolerance aligned perfectly. The moment when warning signs were reframed as personality traits. When danger passed as charisma. When survival strategies were mistaken for strength. And that is why this phase matters so much. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was convincing. It convinced the world that nothing was wrong. And it convinced Scott himself that as long as the show went on, he was still in control. But control built on constant performance is fragile. It doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes in silence behind sold-out crowds and flawless sets. And the question this peak leaves behind is uncomfortable. When everything around you confirms the illusion that you're fine, how do you recognize the moment you're already losing yourself? By the time the public narrative around Scott Weiland began to fracture, the collapse had already been underway for years. It just hadn't looked like collapse yet. It looked like momentum with consequences quietly absorbed elsewhere. Arrests started to puncture the myth, but never deeply enough to stop it. Each incident was treated as an interruption, not a pattern. Each rehab stay was framed as a reset, not a warning. The cycle hardened. Tour, record, relapse, rehab, return. Headlines followed a familiar script. Clean again, back on track. Stronger than ever. What those stories didn't capture was the internal math Scott was forced to do each time he survived. Surviving wasn't relief. It was obligation. Every comeback increased the distance between who he was expected to be and what he could actually sustain. Physically, the cost was cumulative. Dependency narrowed his emotional range, then his stamina. What once helped him transition between worlds began to dictate them. Offstage became unmanageable without chemical intervention. On stage required it. The line between preparation and survival dissolved. And because he could still perform, because his voice still carried, because the show still sold, the system around him interpreted endurance as proof. Privately, the pressure intensified. Scott was no longer just maintaining a band. He was maintaining a story. Fans needed him to be functional. Labels needed him to be reliable. Media needed him to be dramatic but contained. Family needed him present in a way he didn't know how to be. Each role demanded something different. None allowed rest. The prison sentence was supposed to interrupt this. Jail time is often described as a wake-up call, a bottom. For Scott, it was something else entirely. It was enforced stillness without healing. Time removed from the stage, but not from the internal machinery driving him there. When he returned, the expectations didn't soften. They sharpened. If he could survive prison, the logic went, he could survive anything. That belief followed him into rehab after rehab. Facilities changed. Methods shifted. Promises were made sincerely. But recovery requires more than removal. It requires replacement. New ways to regulate emotion. New identities not built on performance. Scott didn't have those tools. What he had was a lifetime of escaping inward pressure by becoming someone else. As the years passed, the narrative grew crueler in its predictability. Fans began to anticipate relapse the way they once anticipated albums. The language around him hardened. Sympathy thinned. Compassion became conditional. The phrase, "he's doing it again," replaced "he needs help." And Scott felt that shift acutely. Shame didn't just come from failure. It came from repetition, from knowing the outcome and being unable to redirect it. Family life deteriorated under the weight of unpredictability. Love became vigilance. Trust turned procedural. Children learned to read mood before reading faces. These aren't dramatic moments. They're erosions. They happen quietly, over years, until the structure looks intact from the outside, but collapses under pressure from within. What makes this phase so devastating is not excess. It's fatigue. Scott wasn't chasing highs anymore. He was avoiding the drop. Each substance, each pattern, was an attempt to keep the floor from falling out beneath him. And the more he relied on them, the smaller his emotional margin became. This is the point where the story often turns moral, where blame is assigned, where responsibility is emphasized. But that framing misses what was actually happening. Scott wasn't refusing to be saved. He was exhausted by the process of surviving. Each rescue came with renewed expectations. Each second chance reduced the possibility of quiet. And the question that hangs over this period is heavier than relapse or recovery. What happens when staying alive becomes a performance in itself? And you no longer remember how to exist without an audience. The later years didn't bring chaos. They brought routine. That was the most dangerous shift. By the time Scott Weiland entered what the press framed as a second act, the language around him had already hardened. Relapse was no longer shocking. Recovery was no longer inspiring. Everything felt pre-written. The only variable was how long each phase would last. Velvet Revolver was introduced as redemption, a supergroup with history, credibility, and the promise of structure. On paper, it made sense. New collaborators meant distance from old patterns. A reset without erasure. For a brief window, it worked. The shows were strong. The voice still cut through. The audience wanted to believe again. Scott wanted to believe too. But belief isn't treatment. And momentum isn't healing. What changed this time was the weight of expectation. A comeback no longer meant a fresh start. It meant proof. Proof that he could be trusted, that he could be consistent, that he could stay intact under pressure. He had never learned to metabolize. The margin for error shrank. One missed rehearsal, one late arrival, one rumor, and the narrative snapped back into place. The scrutiny didn't push him forward. It compressed him. Internally, the fatigue was unmistakable. The substances were no longer about escape or elevation. They were about continuity, keeping the system running, preventing the crash that came when the noise stopped. Each attempt at sobriety exposed the same problem. Without the buffer, the original pain returned, older, heavier, unchanged. Recovery demanded a confrontation Scott had been avoiding since childhood. Remaining present without becoming someone else. Conflicts followed. Band relationships frayed. Ultimatums replaced conversations. The industry's tolerance thinned. Support became transactional. The public read this as stubbornness or self-sabotage, but the pattern underneath was simpler. Scott had learned to survive by performing. When the performance became unsustainable, he didn't know what remained. By the time he returned to smaller tours and quieter stages, the spotlight felt different, less forgiving, less illusion. The crowds were still there, but the energy had shifted from anticipation to assessment. People watched for signs, for cracks, for confirmation. That gaze, once anchoring, now felt invasive. He wasn't being seen. He was being measured. The final stretch wasn't dramatic. It was diminishing. Health issues accumulated. Trust eroded. Opportunities narrowed. Not because talent disappeared, but because reliability had become a prerequisite he couldn't consistently meet. This wasn't a fall. It was a narrowing corridor with fewer exits each year. When Scott died in 2015, it didn't feel like a rupture. It felt like an exhale that had been held too long. No riot, no spectacle, no final statement. Just a body that had been asked repeatedly to restart without ever being allowed to rest. What remains hardest to accept is not that he relapsed, or that he struggled, or that he died. It's that he survived so many times, and each survival demanded a return to the same conditions that broke him in the first place. Rescue without relief, continuation without repair. And the question that closes this chapter is quieter than the headlines ever were. When a life becomes a sequence of comebacks, how long can a person endure being saved before saving stops feeling like mercy at all? By the time the cycle had fully revealed itself, Scott Weiland was no longer chasing transformation. He was negotiating survival. Each so-called turning point arrived with the same promise. This time would be different, yet carry the same constraints that had undone the last. Rebirth in his world meant returning to motion without changing the engine. Reunions were framed as healing. Returning to familiar bandmates was supposed to mean safety, history, and understanding. In practice, it meant reopening old fault lines under new pressure. The music still worked. The chemistry still sparked in moments. But the emotional debt had compounded. Trust had been stressed by years of cancellations, apologies, and near misses. What once felt like shared risk now felt like liability management. Publicly, each announcement read like hope. Privately, it read like a contract. Stay functional. Stay visible. Stay ahead of rumor. The schedule tightened again. Interviews reintroduced the same questions with a gentler tone and sharper subtext. Are you okay now? Can we rely on you this time? Scott learned to answer without answering, to perform reassurance as carefully as he performed songs. There were periods of clarity, short runs where sobriety held and routine steadied. In those windows, he spoke with surprising insight about damage and accountability. But clarity alone couldn't build new habits fast enough to withstand the return of stress. When the pressure resumed, the old solution presented itself immediately. Familiar, efficient, destructive. Attempt at rebirth require a stable landing. Scott never had one. Every restart occurred midair, with expectations attached. Family hoped for presence. Fans hoped for redemption. Industry hoped for profit. Each hope was sincere. Together, they were crushing. Rest would have looked like disappearance. Disappearance would have been read as failure. As the years progressed, the language around him shifted again. Not condemnation, not celebration, resignation. The news cycle shortened. The surprise dulled. Concern became background noise. That shift mattered. It removed urgency without removing danger. The absence of attention didn't bring peace. It brought isolation. On stage, he could still summon the old command. For 90 minutes, he could still become the version of himself that had always worked. Off stage, the silence returned faster than before. The gap between who he was expected to be and what he could maintain widened into something unbridgeable. The effort required to cross it drained him. The final attempts at rebirth weren't announcements. They were personal resolutions, made quietly, broken quietly. There was no longer a narrative strong enough to carry them. Just repetition with diminishing returns. The body kept score. The nervous system remembered everything the mind tried to outrun. What defines this phase isn't failure. It's attrition, the slow erosion that comes from being asked to restart without pause, to be accountable without being held, to be forgiven without being protected from the same conditions. Rebirth, in its truest sense, requires subtraction, fewer demands, fewer eyes, less speed. Scott never received that version. His rebirths were additive, new bands, new tours, new promises layered onto an old wound. And the question that remains at the end of every attempted turning point is not whether he wanted to change. It's whether change was ever allowed to look like rest, instead of another return to the same relentless motion. In the final years, the pace slowed, but not in a way that brought relief. Smaller tours replaced arena runs. Familiar cities returned without the same promise. The machinery of fame had downshifted. Yet the internal demands remained unchanged. What once required adrenaline now required endurance, and endurance had become expensive. Physically, the strain was visible. Energy fluctuated. Health issues accumulated quietly. The voice still carried emotion, but the recovery afterward took longer. Nights stretched. Mornings arrived heavy. This wasn't decline as spectacle. It was wear, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already embedded in routine. Relationships existed inside caution. Love had learned to wait. Trust had learned to verify. Those closest no longer asked for certainty. They asked for stability measured in days, not years. Even hope adjusted its expectations. That adjustment, while protective, also narrowed the space where real rest might have lived. The final tour didn't feel like a statement. It felt procedural. Dates to keep, obligations to honor. The road no longer promised escape or elevation, only continuity. On December 3rd, 2015, he was found unresponsive on a tour bus. 48 years old. No confrontation. No final message. Just a life that stopped in between cities. Public reaction followed a familiar arc shock, softened into summary. Tributes focused on talent. Headlines revisited the pattern. The complexity was compressed into a cautionary tale. But reduction misses what mattered most. This wasn't a story of excess alone. It was a story of unresolved pain carried forward by momentum. The legacy remains complicated, and that's appropriate. The music endures, not because of mythology, but because it captured something honest: alienation, hunger, the need to be seen without being exposed. For listeners, those songs still work because they don't pretend resolution. They live comfortably inside tension. What Is Life offers the next generation isn't instruction. It's recognition. Recognition that survival without rest is not recovery. That repeated second chances without structural change become obligations. That applause can coexist with isolation, and success can obscure the absence of safety. In remembering him, it matters to resist simple endings. He was neither only his talent nor only his struggle. He was a person shaped by early wounds, amplified by visibility, sustained by performance, and finally exhausted by the demand to continue. And the question his legacy leave behind is not how he died or how often he tried to come back. It's quieter and harder to dismiss. When the world keeps asking you to return to the same life that breaks you, what would it take to finally choose rest instead? Scott Weiland's story doesn't end with a lesson. It ends with a pause. Not the kind that resolves tension, but the kind that leaves it hanging in the air. He wasn't destroyed by a lack of talent or opportunity or second chances. He had all of those in excess. What he lacked was something far quieter and far rarer: permission to stop without disappearing. For years, survival was framed as victory. Every comeback was celebrated. Every return was treated as proof. But survival without repair slowly turns into obligation. An obligation, carried long enough, becomes weight. Scott carried that weight across stages, studios, courtrooms, and rehabs. He carried it through applause. He carried it through forgiveness, until caring became the only thing left. His life forces an uncomfortable reconsideration of how we define saving someone. Is it enough to pull them back repeatedly if we return them to the same conditions that fractured them in the first place? Is survival meaningful if it never includes rest or safety, or a life that doesn't require constant performance? Scott Weiland didn't fail at recovery. Recovery failed to meet the reality of the life he was expected to continue living. That distinction matters, because it shifts the story away from judgment and toward understanding. In the end, what remains isn't the collapse. It's the question he leaves behind. When a person spends their entire life becoming what the world needs them to be, how do they ever learn to exist as who they are? When the music finally stops,